Hey guys, a little content warning about this episode. This episode contains extensive discussions about THC, marijuana, CBD, and other controlled substances. Maxed Out Man, its representative, and partners present this information as opinions of the guest, presenters, and host and do not endorse or recommend the behaviors or products discussed. Please be aware of state, local, and federal laws relating to the materials discussed. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, it's Kevin Davis from the Maxed Out Man podcast. This is episode number 50, which is actually pretty cool. It's kind of a milestone from here for us. And this is, we're going to be here with Chris Fontes or Fontes, depending on who you ask, as he just described to me. Chris is the founder and CEO of High Spirits Beverages, a dynamic individual with a rich history of innovation and leadership in the cannabis industry and beyond, successful entrepreneur. His entrepreneurial journey spans several successful ventures, including Trojan Horse Cannabis, Project Hemp Flower, Hemp Exchange, all of which played pivotal roles in shaping the U.S. hemp industry. Chris's visionary leadership led to the development of the industry's products and the launch of Trojan Horse Cannabis and High Spirits Beverages. He's also a dedicated advocate for the hemp and cannabis industries and acts as advisors and policy advisors and all that stuff. So that's your official bio. I appreciate you joining me and coming online. This is a topic I don't know anything about, so I think this will be super exciting.
Yeah, I'm super thankful to be on the show and have the opportunity to share some of the knowledge that I've been acquiring in my life on this subject with your audience. It's a wildly
complicated. Hey, I'll give you full disclosure. My family's from Oklahoma. I live in Montana, and my brother works in a grow. My nephew makes his own strains. My sister is in the distribution side, and her daughter is also in the distribution side. So, ironically, half of my siblings are involved in the cannabis industry in one way or another. I'm not, but I am fascinated with the entrepreneurial side, especially. But so, hey, I appreciate you coming. Give us, that's kind of your official bio from the press kit. But if you want to give us a little bit of your background and kind of how you got here, I know you're an entrepreneur first, and then this is kind of one of those, the industry that you happen to excel in.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of my career, I jumped around and did a bunch of different types of jobs in the tech space, from management to project management and to actual development. I was a software architect for 20-ish years. And when you're a software architect, especially when you become like a senior and you're dealing with big businesses, infrastructure and big systems that help businesses function, you have to know a lot about business, right? You have to, because you have to understand if I make this change to the code, how's it going to impact the end user? How's it going to impact the business? Well, I was running a software agency, and one of my clients, who at the time was running a nurse practitioner business, and my team had all managed their code base for their charting of their patient information, their PHI, private health information. They asked me, hey, do you know anything about hemp? Now, for full disclosure, when I was a teenager, I made some really not great choices and dabbled in intoxicants of all sorts. I had kind of a rough childhood and didn't think I was going to live that long, and was like, let's go hard, because I've only got a couple of years.
Oh, man.
And then I had a kid at 21, and I was like, well, plan B, I guess I'm going to have to live a while. So I'm going to have to make some changes and make some hard choices. But so while I dabbled when I was younger, as an adult, I had also really no cannabis experience from like 21 to 30 or like 32. So anyway, working for this, I have this software agency working for this client. He asked me if I know anything about hemp. And I said, yeah, I used to grow cannabis. Is that what you're talking about? He's like, sort of. And he goes on to tell me about how in 2014, through the Farm Bill, which is a federal omnibus package, it's the largest spending package that's approved, and it has to be reapproved every 5 years. In the 2014 Farm Bill, in an effort to help agricultural U.S., some inspiring senators, namely Mitch McConnell and a couple others, had decided, hey, let's do a pilot program for research institutes and state governments to see if we can grow hemp here stateside, because we have hemp products already. right? We have hemp rope. You can go to Hobby Lobby and buy hemp, right? You can go to Kroger and buy hemp hearts or hemp seed oil. We already have products that have hemp in it in the country, but we're not allowed to grow hemp, which is silly. And I'll go into the background on that too later in this podcast. So anyway, in 2014, he said, let's see if we can grow this stuff here. Let's do some pilot projects. Well, between 2014 and 2018, an entire CBD market exploded. The point was textiles, fiber, grain, more the industrial side of hemp. However, none of that stuff is super lucrative, comparatively speaking, to CBD or what people considered it was going to be lucrative at the time because they didn't know. But through that 4-year period, CBD started really taking off. And it wasn't the national craze that it was for a while. It was pre that, but let's just say a single kilo of CBD isolate was going for like $20,000. So the market was pumping. And this was before it was even removed off the controlled substance list. Then come 2018, they said, you know what? These pilot programs have been great. Let's go ahead and solidify this. Let's create a new definition for hemp, which is simply, by the way, not a scientific or botanical definition. It is simply a legal definition. It's the same cannabis that marijuana is, except for it's 0.3% THC or less. So as long as it has less than that amount of THC, we're going to give it its own definition. We're going to call it hemp, and we're going to remove it from the controlled substance list. So when that happened, the CBD market exploded. And what I was tasked with was building a marketplace for vetted purchases. And the reason is because during that 2014 to 2018 period, there was a lot of shady folks in the space that figured out there was a lot of money to be made, and they'd sell you a truckload of CBD isolate and then send you a truckload of powdered sugar and then disappear off the face of the planet. So it was really difficult to build an industry off of an unstable supply chain. So the idea, the software that I made was this vetted marketplace where we made sure the person actually had the product. They were licensed to do so. We made sure the buyer had the funds. They were licensed to make the purchase. They would purchase from us. We would ship the product on behalf of the third party. We'd basically act like escrow and protect the entire thing. So they wanted me to build this software. And I said, this is a great idea. But again, as a software engineer, I'm asking all these hard business questions they couldn't really answer. And eventually they said, you know what, we didn't think this through as well as we thought we did. Why don't you come on board, build the software, run the company, hire staff, we'll fund it. I said, great, let's do that. So I jumped in and decided to kind of leave the software, the software service that I was running on the side, and kind of did both for a while, and built this thing called the Hemp Exchange. Which launched in 2019, actually. It began in 2018, but really launched publicly in 2019. So we were at the very forefront of this hemp phenomenon that has taken over the planet, or taken over the country anyway. And that's how I got into it. And as I said, software engineering was my primary background. So I'll take a break because I've been talking for a while.
Can you... Oh, no, that's great. Can you explain for those of us that don't really understand and how they... Obviously, when you get the government involved, it's always going to be interesting. But can you just explain the difference between, and you said 0.003 or whatever that, you gave me a number and I forgot what it was, of what differentiates hemp from cannabis, from CBD, and then THC and all that. Can you just walk that through for those of us that aren't really in the know?
Yeah, absolutely. So, cannabis is the species of plant, right? And cannabis can come in different varieties, just like you could say canines, but a Labrador and a Chihuahua are very different. There's a couple of big differences in these genotypes, if you will, of cannabis species. And so some of them are big, bushy, kind of look like Christmas trees, but small, squatty Christmas trees. And they're what you may have seen creates the big fat cola buds that you may have seen on a t-shirt with a tie-dye sort of thing going on. That's what people smoke, is those colas, those buds, those fruits. And that's what those plants look like. They're bushy, and they can get kind of tall actually outdoors. They can be up to 12 feet tall, but they're very wide. Those are cannabinoid producing varieties. And there's 3 different primary varieties in there, which I'll go over in a second. But there's a couple other species that are relevant to our economy. There's fiber varieties, which when you look at how it's planted, instead of a big bushy Christmas tree, it looks more like bamboo. It's a thick rod. They're right up next to each other. They grow really, really tall. And with fiber, you don't even want them to go to flower. So if you start flowering on the top of those things, you've let the crop go too far. It's at least time to cut it down now. Then there's grain, and grain is where we get our hemp seed oil, and animal feed and things of this nature. And for grain, it looks a lot like fiber. It looks like bamboo, except you do let it go to flower, and you have genetics that perform well for grain production. And you intentionally let it go to seed because you're going to be harvesting that seed out of it. So those are the different primary types of cannabis species, or they're all cannabis species, but the different types of genotypes, if you will. Then within the cannabinoid producing varietals, there's three primary types, chemotypes. Chemotype 1 is high THC. So it makes primarily THC and not a lot of anything else. This is what you'll typically find in dispensaries in regulated marijuana markets these days. Nowadays, they're like 20 to 30% THC. Back in the 60s, it was like 5 to 8. So you can see there's a pretty significant difference. And when they say you're not smoking your grandpa's weed, you're not. It's very different, very narcoticized now. Then there's type 3, which typically hemp will be a type 3 in the cannabinoid side of things. And a type 3 means high CBD production, low THC to no THC production. Then right in the middle is type 2, which has a good balance of THC and CBD. Now, the reason this is important to your audience if they ever consume these things is THC is what creates the, we'll say, impairing effects, the psychoactivity, right? It's what you feel. It's what you go, oh, man, have you ever thought about why pizzas are circle, but they come in a square box, but you cut them into triangles? Like, that's where the THC is going to create those thoughts. CBD has a lot of positive medical benefits, which I typically am not allowed to talk about because if I'm selling something, but I'll refrain from pitching my products on this podcast. And they have anti-inflammatory. You can read about how CBD and THC would stop a cytokine storm, which is very relevant to some recent pandemic sort of things. Joints, make your joints feel better. It can help with anxiety. It can help with depression. All these various things. But it's more like a daily supplement. You have to take it daily to have that build-up effect for it to do those things. And I could talk about your endocannabinoid system in a little bit and go deeper into that. However, THC you feel immediately, right? Additionally, THC can make you sort of panicky. Like, especially now at these 28%, THC joints you can get or flower. If you haven't smoked since the 60s or even since the 90s or maybe even the early 2000s, and you take a hit off of a joint that's 28%, you're probably going to have a panic attack, like a legitimate, oh my God, I'm freaking out. My heart won't stop racing. You get real paranoid. Well, CBD actually counteracts those negative side effects of THC. So if you're going to consume THC, I always highly recommend pairing that with CBD. And that's why that type 2 chemotype for me, and I think for most consumers, is a really good option. And if you're new to cannabis and you're buying a THC product, you want a lot of CBD with your THC, and maybe even more than a 1-to-1 ratio, maybe like a 5 or 10-to-1 CBD to THC. And that'll prevent you from having that negative experience of that paranoia, rocking yourself in a corner. Oh my God, I ate too many edibles. Am I stuck like this forever?
And are they creating? And I don't care if you push your particular products. It's totally fine with me because I want people to understand. But now, are the people creating the products doing that for the end user, or they're like, hey, we want or are they literal drug pushers where it's like we want to give the maximum effect we can for the product so that the person feels it, or are they because I know one of the problems with edibles is that people will be like, hey, I'm going to take this edible. I don't feel anything after 15 minutes. I'm going to take 5 more. Yeah. And then an hour later, you're in the back of your closet like you're describing.
Yeah, we always call that the oops dose, right? You take one and 15 minutes later to a half hour, you don't feel it. You take a second one and then you feel the first one and you go, oops. That's no. Going to be a problem when that second one kicks in. Yeah. So the question was, do manufacturers provide these sorts of experiences intentionally for their customers? The answer is some do, but it's a complicated market right now. So going on the business side of things, you have the hemp industry, then you have the marijuana industry, both of which are cannabis, both come from the same species of plant and both make similar products. I mean, in some cases, exactly the same product. My company, Trojan Horse Cannabis, was the first company to figure out that the hemp bill provided enough THC wiggle room to make edibles that could be not a controlled substance and can be shipped through the mail. So we got approval from USPS to ship our edibles through the mail. We got our very first state approval was Utah State, of all states. And the reason we chose Utah is, one, they're very conservative. And then two, they actually have a product registration list where when you send them the product, their lawyers have to look at it and say, is this a legal product in our state per our own laws and rules and regulations? And they tried to deny me, or they told me flat out, we want to find a reason to say no to this, but we can't. So I guess you could sell these in the state. So there's that industry. There's the hemp industry with intoxicating THC, which I sort of kicked off in some regards on the D9 side, when I'll talk about D9 and D8 in a minute as well. Then there's the marijuana industry, which is a traditional Colorado dispensary, Washington, California, Nevada dispensary. And the two industries are somewhat at civil war with each other. And I've been trying to build bridges between the two industries and have them work together towards a better goal for all of citizens of the U.S. But from their perspective, they jumped into the market well before 2018, even before 2014, some of these companies, before the Farm Bill even existed, and definitely before, we'll say, impairing hemp products existed. And they spent a lot of money, some of it institutional money, some of it their own money, to start these businesses and buy the $1 million marijuana license and start the facility. And they're heavily regulated. Marijuana is subject to an IRS tax called 280E, which means as a business, you cannot deduct anything from your taxes except for your cost of goods. So anything outside of cost of goods is taxable. So you end up paying, you can end up owing more in tax than you made in profit for the year as a company if you're not careful. So it's a very dangerous business to run if you don't know what you're doing, especially from an accounting, margins. And if you're not penny pinching, it's a rough spot. Or you're not backed institutionally, so you could just burn through $150 million a quarter like some of these larger cannabis companies do. It's so they're mad at the hemp industry. They're like, we put all this time in, we're hanging on by a thread. We're taxed up the yin yang. Our state is taxing us. In Washington State, I just found out there's a 37% excise tax on the marijuana industry here, that's on top of the IRS 280E issue, in which you can't deduct operating expenses. And so their effective tax rate is like 50%, which is insanity.
And that, as I understand it, just, my wife makes fun of me because I got involved in watching Drugs Inc. and, all these other shows that talk about the business side of the drug industry. But as I understand it, that actually is one of the things that has pushed growers and producers back into the black market, right? Because it's like, hey, we want to be legit, but we have this product and it's become so bureaucratically heavy, so tax heavy that we can't afford to do it. So we're just gonna they either kind of do a little bit here and a little bit there, or they just shift back to black market.
Yeah, there's a lot of businesses and growers in those businesses that have eventually just gone back to the black market. And on top of that, there's an industry term called diversion, where it starts as legal product, but it falls off the back of a truck into not legal product and is sold usually to go across state lines to different markets. Because if you're in California, or let's take Washington, for example, and Oregon, both, they've got such an oversupply. They grew more in Oregon than Oregon citizens could consume in like 3 years or something like that in 1 year. And so they're sitting on this massive oversupply. And so it's natural that some businesses are going to say, we're taxed up the butt. We can't possibly handle this. We need revenue from somewhere. A pound of flour is going for $300 when on the open market it could go for like $2,500. And then you have super dry states that are willing to pay you $5,000 to $6,000 for a pound on the black market, and they're willing to do all the trucking, right? So they just make a phone call and say, "Hey, man, I'll give you $50,000 cash. You leave it in the back step. We pretend it never happened, and we move on with life." And those businesses can stay open a little bit longer. So while I'm not necessarily saying I support that section of the industry, I know it's happening, and I know it's why it's happening. And like you said, the entire black market only exists because of overregulation and overtaxation. The reality is, if you're making, let's say you're making $1 million a year, which in a business world isn't a ton, but you're making $1 million a year selling product, and then you go, man, I really want to go legit. What would that take? And then you start running the numbers and go, okay, well, I'll be negative this year instead of positive. I'm not going to do that. I'll just take my chances because the criminal penalties are so insignificantly low compared to the tax penalties of joining up. And we really need to fix that problem. And that's something that I advocate for, even though it's we'll say the other side of the industry. I really view this as one holistic industry that needs to come together. And so I'm very pro fixing that problem, because ultimately, when this is legalized at a federal level, the two markets are going to consolidate into one market anyway. These are going to be our competitors. These are going to be our brothers in arms, if you will. And we need to set, if we let their industry get so far out of control with regulations, that's going to impact how the federal regulations go. So it's important now that we try to make that more reasonable. So by the time it gets to the federal level, it's also reasonable.
Mm. And like I said, you know, anytime you get government involved, and there may have been, you know, I think that, and I'd love for you to explain kind of the federal legality side of things versus state legality. I'm also interested in, you know, the economy of it being federally illegal, and the issues that creates with, you know, you got these distributors or these, you know, dispensaries with huge safes full of nothing but cash, because they have no, you know, they have a very limited way that they can do that. But yeah, go into that, because that's one thing that fascinates me. And I'm also interested, and I'm giving you too many questions, but I'm interested in like the criminality aspect of it, and whether or not the quote unquote state legalization has actually made it, you know, do we have a bigger criminal problem than we had before this happened?
Yeah, great questions. So let's start with the federal legality and sort of the criminalization of cannabis. And I'll give a quick history lesson here too, because we kind of talked about that early on. So cannabis used to be used medicinally by humans, and probably recreationally, pretty much since humans have existed. In pretty much every culture, we have some form of archaeological evidence that cannabis was used by those people. Now, by the time America was sort of up and running,
fossilized pizza boxes, or
yeah, exactly, Doritos and Cheetos, more accurately. Yeah, that was great. So you know, we know that humans have been consuming this stuff, and here in the U.S., you know, by the time, you know, around colonization time in history, if you will, that population had sort of lost touch with using cannabis as medicine for some reason. And then, as you know, colonization took over a good portion of the planet and spread like wildfire. And so that's how we ended up in a situation where most of the people on the planet consumed cannabis as a regular daily thing, versus almost nobody did. Well, some areas still did, like Latin America, for example, was still very prevalent in using cannabis as daily analgesics and things of this nature, and just inflammation, what have you. Well, when a lot of immigrants came into our country, or depending on, you know, the location, our country border kind of dipped into their territory, and suddenly they were American. Back in the day, they had these products, right? They had these plants with them. They had these seeds, and they just grew it in their backyard and consumed it as they normally would, like they always had, like their grandparents had. Well, Henry Anslinger was one of the folks responsible for the G-Men during Prohibition. And he had all this funding to go stop all of these moonshiners and bootleggers and such. And come de-prohibition of alcohol, and he's sitting around with a bunch of budget and a bunch of folks and nothing to do. And he's like, we better justify our existence. What can we target? What's the next problem we can create to justify our existence? And he thought immediately, you know what? I'm about sick and tired of Mexicans in our country, so let's target them. So he created this big propaganda around the Mexican culture, which spread into the Black culture as well, and said that marijuana is the problem with these people, and that's what we need to do to get rid of them, is get rid of their marijuana. So he started this giant campaign, this big Reefer Madness campaign, which if you've ever seen the movie Reefer Madness, it's quite hysterical to watch these days. But it is like shockingly long. So maybe just take a couple samples of it off YouTube or something. But
go to YouTube, get a couple of shorts from it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then move on with life. Yeah, it's like an hour and a half, I think. But anyway, Henry Anslinger at the time, you know, the federal government had much less control over the states back then. And so he had to like basically travel literally state to state and convince them that they should ban marijuana in their state. And he did this on a platform of, and this is quite literally, like, you can have record of this. This isn't a controversy or conspiracy. He said things like, marijuana, it makes the darkies think they're as good as the whiteys. And marijuana, it will
Wow.
kill your neighbor, right? Or you'll kill you first. You get high, then you kill your neighbor. Marijuana, it makes black people want to sleep with white women. All the stuff like this that was like, absolutely ludicrous. One of his expert witnesses, who was on his team, had once said in court, testified that he smoked marijuana, turned into a bat, flew around the room, bit somebody, and almost died, but thankfully recovered. So this is a kind of crazy hysteria, and people believed it too, which is even more like, God, I thought we were smarter back then, but maybe not. So anyway, he made it
Well,
illegal.
I mean, I think we've proven that we believe a hell of a lot of stuff that people tell us.
Yes, absolutely. So we progress from that to this marijuana reefer madness phase for several decades. We get up to World War II. During World War II, all of a sudden we realized, hey, you know what we're super short of in this country? Hemp. We still use it for rope, for sailing, for boats. We use it industrially all the time, and we're not getting it from external sources fast enough to support our war efforts. So all of a sudden, even though it was totally illegal, they said, tell you what, if you hemp farmers start growing hemp, we'll pay you to do so. And so there was a small window during World War II, and they called it Victory for Hemp, or Hemp for Victory, I think, where they encouraged farmers to grow and subsidize those crops to make them do it, so we'd have enough hemp in the states. And then that war ended, and they're like, "Oh yeah, just kidding. You can't do that anymore. We'll arrest you now. It's super dangerous again." So they made it illegal again. And then fast forward to Nixon times. Nixon was hard against drugs, and specifically, he hated jazz music, black people, and hippies. And he wanted to penalize those communities as much as he could. And he did that with the Controlled Substance Act. And there's a reason that the CSA exists. There's a reason it's categorized the way it is. And there's a reason that most of the things that are in Schedule 1 aren't really Schedule 1, like marijuana, for example, that even though the U.S. has a patent on anti-cancerous properties of cannabis, not only do they hold a patent for that, but they also say there's zero medical benefit of cannabis, so it's got to be on Schedule 1. You can't even research it. So it's like a blatant dichotomy, left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing, or they know and they just don't care. And they're in cohorts with each other, which is really the case. So he made it illegal again. That's the state of things up until 1996. In 96, California said, this is ridiculous. We're going to allow cancer, terminally ill, and glaucoma patients to be able to purchase medical marijuana. And they started a very small program. And that sort of kicked off the various states kicking off medical programs, which led to recreational programs, which kind of led to where we're at today. But the bottom line is, at a federal level, it's still a Schedule 1 controlled substance, just like fentanyl. Or fentanyl's not even Schedule 1, it's Schedule 3, I think. But like some serious heavy stuff. And it's treated that way. And so every state that's doing this is basically giving the middle finger to the federal government and saying, we're not going to follow your rules. And the only reason they've been getting away with it is because Obama basically sent this thing called the Cole Memo to the district attorney at the time that said, hey, you are not to spend any dollars at the Department of Justice attacking, litigating, prosecuting, or arresting, or even investigating medical marijuana companies that are running in a state that have that approval, because it's a waste of our resources at this point. And so the DEA basically got involved and took it to court and said, hey, there's no way we're going to be able to have the time or resources to make a distinction between medical or recreational. So you need to have this whole thing go away. And the judge was basically like, that's not our problem. We don't really care that you're going to struggle with that. And they said, fine, we're not going to enforce any of it. And they kind of whined about it. And that's why they don't enforce it still. So the DEA isn't really enforcing state programs, simply because they were given instructions not to, as not an executive order, but a strongly worded letter that they decided to adhere to. And so these states are running, if you think about it, almost like cartels, because they're basically saying, hey, you give us money and we'll use our law enforcement and our power to shield you from opposition that would otherwise try to come and take what's yours. And that's exactly what they're doing. Then again, in 2018, you had hemp completely exempted from that. So hemp is not a controlled substance. It is not a Schedule 1, according to the CSA or the DEA. The DEA has said flat out, like, hey, hemp, that's not our stuff. Like, we don't enforce it. It's not our regulatory authority. We don't touch it. So those in the hemp space get the benefit of not having 280E. They can ship across state lines. They can send it through the mail, and the DEA is nowhere to be seen because we're not under their purview. While marijuana still is a Schedule 1 and it still is under the purview of the DEA, they're just deciding not to enforce. So that's kind of the legalities of it. You know, in the marijuana side and the history and then the legalities. On the marijuana side, you can't get banking very easily unless you have a small credit union that's localized to your state that is, you know, basically that credit union or bank has to also give the middle finger to the feds and say, we're going to risk having our industry protection by banking these folks, and they're doing it. And so far, none of these banks have been put through the ringer for it, but national banks won't touch it. Additionally, you have no credit card processing.
Yeah, because a lot of those small credit unions are self-funded and self-insured, so they don't have FDIC to worry about. Because it's the FDIC insurance that really is what has you. Yeah. That dictates your behavior as a bank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And without that insurance, which is, less protection sometimes for the business entity as well, because who knows what happens to their money if that bank collapses. But on the flip side, they don't have to listen to the feds as often, which is probably a good thing for those banks and the industry likely. So on the hemp side, however, we can get credit card processing. We do have national banking. We pay a little bit for it. We're considered high risk. So our credit card percentages, most credit card percentages these days as a business entity, you're like 1.8 to like 2.5, somewhere in there. We're at like 4.5% on credit card transactions. We have to pay a monthly surcharge of a couple $100 just to have our checking account open, things like that. But we can have it. We do have it. And we have access to it. Now, the tricky part about legality, again, we already talked about marijuana and where it's not really legal, but the states sort of sanction it. At a federal level, none of it's legal. Our industry, hemp, is not a controlled substance. However, the FDA has purview over regulating what gets put into your body. And the FDA, right after the 2018 Farm Bill was signed, said, hey, just as a reminder, we're in charge of this. And we say no. So don't put it in foods. And we're like, cool, there's already a robust market that's been happening for 4 years. There's already millions of dollars transacting. We're just going to keep doing this until you enforce. And basically, the FDA got stuck in a weird position where, where the FDA is funded by the ONDCP. The ONDCP does not like cannabis. Why? Because the ONDCP likes drugs, because that's what they are. And they control the budget for the IRS, which is why we have 280E. You can actually find a memo in the Federal Register from ONDCP to IRS when the California market kicked off saying, figure out a way to penalize these companies with taxes. And hence they found the 280E provision and we're like, yep, we can apply that. Well, ONDCP also probably is telling FDA, don't you dare allow cannabis to go into foods because that's going to screw up our entire operation. Right? FDA is founded around single molecule. Every drug, every over-the-counter drug, every clinical trial, it's all based around single molecule. In fact, if you have a 2-molecule regimen, let's say you want to cure some weird disease, and you found that if you put this molecule with this molecule at the same time, they work together better and it will actually kill the disease, but one on its own won't. You can't really run that through the FDA. In fact, when you're doing trials, you have to run each molecule independent first, then you can add them together. And even then, it's questionable if you'll get approved because FDA really runs off single molecule, where cannabis has multiple molecules that are affecting the human being, from the cannabinoids, which we know of over 150 of them now, to the terpenes, to flavonoids, to various VSCs and things of this nature that create the effects that you feel. It's much harder to throw a clinical trial because you can ask your brother about this. You may grow one plant one season and then grow that same plant next season. If the conditions are slightly different, you may have not a completely different, but a different enough cannabinoid profile. Those chemicals in that plant will be different. And so if you can't consistently reproduce the exact same product, it's really hard to do clinical trials, hence the problem. So that's kind of a general overview of the business of it all, the legality, the criminalized or non-criminalized portion of it. It's also interesting to note that some of these states that have legalized still have not legalized home grow, which kind of shows you where the allegiances lie. It's about tax dollars and tax revenue for the states. And if you're growing your own, you're not buying, so they don't want to allow that. So true legalization comes when we have home grow capabilities, and you can just treat it like a tomato plant in your backyard. It's not a big deal. But I'll break there.
Yeah, I mean, but then they'll regulate that, right? No, number of plants, and which they do now, right? I mean, even for recreational, they regulate the amount of. But so is it enforced? Is it really enforced at all at this point, or is it just kind of like one of these? Hey, like when you're speeding on the highway, right? It's like if I stay 6 or under, the likelihood of me getting pulled over is pretty low, right? Like, so, but if I go 10 over, then I'm going to get pulled over. Like, so there's this like gray area of legality, or is it like,
that's absolutely the case.
Is it being enforced?
Yeah. So on the marijuana side, it is being enforced on states that are, both states that have approved and not approved programs. In approved programs, it's generally heavily regulated, overly regulated, to the point where you have to put a tag on that plant that you're growing, and that tag has to stay with that material all the way through its life cycle. We don't do this with anything else. Like when you buy a beer, you're like, can you trace it back to the hop that was grown? Like, not a chance. Now, wine maybe, but that's because that's the culture and that's the experience, but not so much with anything else. So those are enforced, and if you're diverting and you're caught diverting, you're going to pay a penalty for that. If you're in a state that does not have a legal program and you're carrying around a couple pounds of weed, you could still go to jail. Like, absolutely. People are still being put in jail for cannabis all the time. It's really sad, actually. On the hemp side, it's more like what you're talking about. The FDA says you can't do this, but it's a regulation violation, which could have criminal penalties still. It's not a legislative or a code violation. But the FDA has basically said, here's the thing. If we approve this, we might get our funding cut, and Pharma is also going to be super pissed at us. If we don't approve it, the industry's mad at us. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do nothing, and we're going to hide in the corner and hope nobody points at us and asks us any questions. So they've been doing that for a while. And in practice, what that looks like is they say, don't make egregious medical claims, and we're not going to pull you over. It's stay under 10 miles an hour over the limit. We're not going to pull you over. Some companies have had enforcement upon them from the FDA for saying things like, buy our CBD, it cures cancer. Well, don't say that, because it's not necessarily true. It can be in some certain instances, but it's not a blanket statement that's always true. You shouldn't be making those statements. But they have got warning letters and enforcement from FDA. So yes, there's a little enforcement on that side, but not a ton. And it's even more complicated because on the hemp side, being national, every state can make their own rules about this stuff. So we have a 50-state patchwork of what is and isn't allowed. And this is a wide range from absolutely nothing, like Idaho, where they're like, you can't even, if you even say the word cannabis, you're going to get tackled. To states like Oklahoma that basically said, yeah, do whatever you want. We don't really care. Here's licenses. It's all medical, but like it's $50. Actually, I don't know how much license is. It's not that expensive. And they're unlimited. And they don't really enforce much.
Yeah, I mean, so my family's in Oklahoma, like I said, I don't spend a lot of time, but the last time I went back, it had been a while, and I actually took my 26-year-old daughter, who actually uses a vape pen for anxiety and for sleep and THC vape pen. But like we see this place, and it's literally a drive-through THC smoothie bar. And she's like, what the hell? This is okay. And like, it's, and they're, every strip mall has multiple dispensaries. Ironically, it actually cost me a bunch of money because my dog ate a roach out of the grass and ended up in the emergency room for dogs. It was kind of funny because she was like literally falling over because she was high. And evidently this happens a ton. Like we go to it's a side story, but we go to the vet and they're like, do you guys smoke? Is there weed in the house? And I'm like, no, we're not even from here and we don't. But she was like, well, we see this like 5 or 6 times a week. So we're pretty sure that she got a hold of some weed. But anyway, I thought that, because you mentioned Oklahoma, it was really striking to me because it's literally just everywhere.
Yeah. And in a lot of other states, because of hemp, it's the same way. Like you go to Tennessee and there's restaurants where you can get a THC infused ketchup just to dip your fries in or a different sausage. And we haven't talked much about my company, but one of the things we do is we sell a beverage, and those beverages can be purchased in just about every bar in Minnesota. So you're sitting down, instead of having a drink, an alcoholic drink, you can have a THC beverage. And so this normalization is happening very rapidly, and it's generally happening in non-marijuana states faster, because in marijuana states, they really want to protect their license and their income. So you have this dispensary model, other than Oklahoma and a couple exceptions. But generally speaking, you have to go to the dispensary to buy your product. You can't go to the 7-Eleven, pick up a 12-pack of THC beverages and go home. You can't get it at the bar. You can't get it at the restaurant. There's no smoking lounges, or very few. In hemp, primarily hemp states where they don't have a regulated marijuana market, especially if they're regulating the hemp, it's everywhere. Everywhere you would expect to purchase alcohol, you can purchase a THC product. These are stadiums, movie theaters, etc. And there's pockets of this, and it's proliferating fast across the country. But I think within the next 5 years, in most locations, you'll probably experience 1 to 2 locations in your daily just going abouts of seeing a THC product available for purchase at somewhere you're at.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast about, like, in some of what you talked about with the, big pharma industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, and how, drugs. And I'm a conservative, tend to lean more towards libertarian ideals, like, kind of somewhere, not full libertarian, but sort of like, hey, if that's something you want to do, go for it. I don't really want to hear about it. I don't really care, and that's pretty much on most of those issues. But yeah, that's like is it a matter, just on that note, is it a matter that the cannabis industry just simply doesn't have hundreds of billions of dollars to influence policy the way that big pharma does? And I'm not a fan of our government in general and how all the corruption is and all that stuff, but
yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you that I was hardcore libertarian before getting into this space. And after seeing what unregulated companies will sell to consumers, I'm like, okay, yeah, we need some regulations after all, because people are not nice. There's products being made in our space right now that are absolutely dangerous to humans, or they could very well be dangerous to humans because they're brand new. We made it in a lab and nobody's ever tried it before. But here, let's sell it to the human population and see what happens. So that's happening in hemp right now, and in some cases, marijuana as well. Which is a big problem. But yeah, it's absolutely, the funding isn't there to lobby properly. And, I'm very involved in activism now. I've always kind of been abreast of what's going on in our politics. It's always been interesting to me. But now I'm going to DC and lobbying and talking to, the House Ag Committee. In fact, through my work with the National Industrial Hemp Council, I'm the policy co-chair there. That we were asked, NIHC was asked by the House Ag Committee to make a couple of bills for this next farm bill. And I was then tasked with one portion of that. So I actually wrote a bill that got submitted for House Ag to review that might get included in the farm bill. So I'm pretty up to speed with how this is all functioning now. And at the end of the day, cannabis, while it's a very large, probably holistically, not counting the black market, like somewhere between $40 and $60 billion industry, it's still not, that's spread across a bunch of small entities generally, and there's not enough cash there to put into lobbying in a massive way. And there's also still, regardless of lobbying efforts, there's still a lot of people at the federal level that think cannabis is like heroin. And if we legalize it, kids are going to die in the street. And they really don't know. They just don't know any better, right? They grew up in the generation where it was talked about like heroin, and it was thought about like heroin. And even if it wasn't heroin, it was the gateway to heroin. The reality now is very different. We know that, and we've got the scientific evidence to back that up. And we have long human trials, if you will, to back that up. But they grew up in that era, and they're just at the age where they're like, I'm never going to change my mind on this. It doesn't matter what you show me. My parents are the same way. My dad's unfortunately fighting cancer right now, and he won't try cannabis to help his symptoms or even help the prognosis because it's the devil's lettuce and it's just not to be touched. And so there's some of that, some of entrenchment, and like, I don't know how to say this in a more polite way, but we kind of need some generational die-off. Some of the folks that are, pushing a centenarian, pushing 100, they probably shouldn't be in Congress anymore. And those folks just need to move on. And as younger folks fill the seats, they'll be like, yeah, cannabis is better than alcohol. Why are we treating it like the devil? Our
Well,
entire
and
country,
I think that ideology that, you know, we shouldn't have people that have been in Congress for 50 or 60 years and they, you know, are or in any part of our government. If they can't form coherent sentences, they probably have a hard time, you know, doing
absolutely.
their job. So I
Yeah.
think that's a blanket statement for all of our government, regardless of the cannabis side of
Absolutely.
things.
It absolutely is. And watching the dysfunction too, like, you know, the amount of committees I've sat and listened to where a senator is proposing something to the committee that needs to approve it. So it goes on to the next step and have a committee member literally say, I don't know anything we're talking about. I don't understand any of this. I'm just going to vote yes because you're asking me to vote yes. Like, hold on.
Yep.
The whole reason for a committee
Yeah.
is for you to do the due diligence, understand what you're saying, and decide if it should go on to the next step. Not just saying yes because you're doing a senator a favor. That's ridiculous. That's exactly how it works.
Yeah, I will say that if you have not visited Washington, D.C. and actually seen the inner workings of our government, then you should not really you have to do that. If you have an opinion about what's good and bad about our government, you really need to go and see. Like, they don't show up for bills. They're, you know, you go to these, you go sit in the House, you go sit in the Senate in the gallery, and there's literally like 3 people there because they're voting from their monitor in their office, or they don't read the bills. Because, dude, some of these bills are like 3,700 pages.
Yeah.
Who in the right mind is going to be able to read through that, you know, without a staff of 50 to give them little bitty sections? But yeah, it's scary.
And even if you do have the staff to pull it off, you know, this is why they have staffers, is because the staffer's job is to basically read everything and then give them the Cliffs Notes. And so all these Congress folks are voting on Cliffs Notes of what their hired interns that are usually like sub 22 are telling them the bill says it says. That and what the politician or the lobbyist is telling them it says as well. And they're going purely off that. They're not really reading the bills unless it's really, really critical or a super important or highly contentious bill that everyone's going to fight over, you know, super pedantic language. But most of the time you're right.
Yeah, and then it depends on whose hands in which pocket. And I get a little cynical about our government, especially how things have progressed over the last decade, especially. But I do want to talk a little bit about so I'm a health and fitness guy, work out all the time. I mean, caffeine is the drug of my choice. I don't drink, don't do any other drugs, illegal or otherwise, other than like a multivitamin. That's basically, and I've talked about it on the podcast, TRT, testosterone therapy. But like, because the general sentiment, and obviously this is true for anything, the general sentiment is that by legalizing cannabis and other drugs, just like with alcohol, and you can throw that in there always is a sense that there can be abuse. But I think one of the problems with the messaging is that cannabis is basically safe no matter what, right? Like that tends to be there. There's no counterpoint to that, right? To say there's a caveat here, right? So I just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the reality is cannabis is safe for most adults, but it is most, not all. There are folks that cannabis could induce if various mental disorders should not be paired with cannabis, but they are pretty few. And so I think the reason the over-exaggeration of cannabis is good for everybody all the time is because the population it's not good for is really so small as a percentile that the statement is true way more times than it's not. But you're absolutely right. I think, you know, I'm a kid of the Dare generation, right? I grew up around Dare.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the problem with Dare was it said, if you try weed, you'll end up in the gutter dead, right? It was very aggressive and very overly stated. And I was peer pressured into cannabis when I was 14 and got high. And I was like, this is amazing. What? I'm not dead. I'm not in the gutter. Oh my God, they're lying about everything. I'm going to try all the drugs and see what happens because clearly they don't know what they're talking about. Well, some of those drugs they were completely accurate on. They
were right about.
They were, it turns out. But I believe in full transparency education, right? Cannabis is good for most people. Can it be abused? Absolutely. What is the risk of abuse? If it's abused, what does that do to the person, right? And what are the varying degrees of abuse and risk? And you know, is there any mortality involved? Can you OD from it, et cetera? All these things I think need to be discussed in reality. Something we're seeing now is a condition called cannabis hypermesis syndrome, which basically we don't exactly know the cause. I think there's two schools of thought, and I think they're probably both correct to some extent. But essentially, if you're a heavy cannabis consumer, you can develop this condition where every time you consume cannabis, or even with a delayed effect of a couple days after consuming cannabis, you get violently ill and you start throwing up like 45 times an hour sort of thing. And you have incredible stomach cramps and your head hurts and you can't stay hydrated. And it's really painful and horrible. And then naturally, cannabis is an antiemetic. So being a cannabis consumer, you're like, oh God, my stomach hurts. I'm going to smoke some weed to make my stomach feel better. It actually makes it worse. Right. And we think that this is happening. I personally think that there's two causes, and science is getting close to defining this, but we're pretty sure. One is there's a lot of pesticides used in commercial grows that are not tested for. Then when you concentrate that into an oil, the percentage of pesticide goes up drastically. Then when you consume a lot of that oil, you're inhaling a lot of vaporized pesticides and herbicides and fungicides that you may not really be good for you. So I think that's probably the primary cause. But I think a secondary cause is people basically just hitting THC too often. And it's literally just down-regulating their receptors. So let me talk about that for a quick second. Every mammal on the planet has an endocannabinoid system. We didn't know that humans had an endocannabinoid system or that this even really existed until like we started really publishing scientific data on around like 1996. In fact, up until I think it was 5 years ago, there was an exiting doctorate class, a medical doctor class, that it was graduating, and they were given a survey, and they were asked, "Have you ever heard of the endocannabinoid system?" And something like 5% of doctors said, "Yeah, I've heard of that." Right, so it's pretty new. We don't know a lot about it, but what we do know is that our body has one. We know that it sort of acts like the bodyguard or the check and balance system for all your other systems. So if your nervous system isn't functioning properly, the endocannabinoid system's like, whoa, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. Let me adjust some hormones to get you to perform better, right? The endocannabinoid system is the overall homeostasis system for our bodies. And we produce endocannabinoids, cannabinoids we make in our own brains and bodies. Anandamide, for example, is one of them. And anandamide binds to your CB1 receptor. You have CB1 and CB2 receptors in your brain. That's what these things connect to. THC directly antagonizes and binds to those receptors, to CB1. CBD binds to basically to the sides of those receptors and helps modulate the experience. Well, what happens in your body when you overload yourself with an exogenous compound like a phytocannabinoid created by a plant? You're putting it into your body. If you have too much of it, your body goes, there's too much. We don't need this much. Start down regulating, meaning start killing some of our receptors so we don't have as many, so we're not as sensitive, so we can tolerate the amount that's being thrown at us. I suspect with the since concentrates have come out and people are doing way more cannabis than they used to, it's a higher percentage. And with concentrates, you can get up to 90% THC, and you could hit that all day long. It's way more cannabis than we've ever been able to ingest before due to, progress, I guess, and innovation. But I think it's burning out your CB1 receptors. They're down-regulating. They're not functioning right. And so your endocannabinoid system takes a total dump, and your system just goes haywire in response. Like, hey, something's wrong. Throwing up sounds like a good idea because normally that fixes the problem. And so I think CHS is a combination of inhalation of chemicals mixed with potentially overconsumption of THC. So there are problems, right? You can't just hit THC all day long and not have medical issues from it potentially. On top of that, there's a laziness factor, right? Now, that's sort of a stigma, and science has proven that most cannabis consumers are actually more active than non-cannabis consumers. However, there's that quintessential stoner archetype that exists for a reason. Is because that can happen, right? You can be that person that won't get out of mom's basement at 32, who just plays Xbox and eats Cheetos all day and has really no ambition in life. That's a possibility that you need to be guarded of if you're a cannabis consumer. So there are dangers. They're just much less dangerous, generally speaking, than like alcohol even. Where alcohol is going to destroy your body with continued use, guaranteed. Alcohol is significantly more impairing to the point where you make decisions maybe you wouldn't make sober. When you're drunk and you look at your car and you go, I could drive, I got that. right? It's this false sense of confidence. Or you see someone in a bar, you're like, I could take that guy. Like, not a chance you could take that guy, but sure. Cannabis is the opposite, right? You look at your car and you're like, I don't know, seems super complicated. I'd rather just sit here and eat Cheetos and watch TV, right? Or have someone else, or go take a walk in the woods or something. And if you're out at a bar drinking THC, you're like, I'm not fighting anybody today. What's your name, man? What do you do for a living? That sounds cool. Nice shirt. Like, it's a whole different experience than alcohol. So it is generally safer. And I think we get excited about the fact that you can become impaired. And generally speaking, for most people, if you go a little hard that night, you get a better night's sleep and you wake up and you're like, God, my joints feel great today, instead of, the quintessential hangover. And I think the excitement overrides the accuracy and how safe or unsafe these products are.
And even, I mean, so the question I've had, obviously we know now smoking is bad for you. I mean, part of it is that it's filled with chemicals and all that kind of stuff because you're ingesting, you're literally smoking stuff. So that's, I'm curious about smoke in terms, because you're literally smoking this plant, which is similar, but not quite the same as far as like normal cigarette smoke. And then like the education and not even the education factor, but like the vapes, because the vapes are literally vaporizing aluminum and, all of those kind of things. So it's almost like a delivery method for the cannabis that becomes the problem. Is that something that you see in this, just like you would in other industries?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the benefits of smoking cannabis versus smoking tobacco in a current, U.S. tobacco system, or really planetary tobacco system, in tobacco, they add all kinds of chemicals to that tobacco, including things like formaldehyde. Right, so you're literally just smoking formaldehyde when smoking a cigarette. In cannabis, there are responsible growers that don't add pesticides, fungicides, and things like that to their grow. And let's talk about those for a minute, because of course, if someone ladens your plant material with some crap and then you smoke it, that's not really good for you. But if it's a clean plant to begin with that you're inhaling, what's super interesting about cannabis versus tobacco is THC and CBD has anti-cancerous properties. And I have a running suspicion that has not been proven by trials. So this is the thoughts of Chris and nothing more, that the positive anti-cancerous effects basically nullify the cancer-creating problems that smoking creates from inhaling carcinogens. The only thing I have to back that up is they've shown with empirical evidence that people who only smoke cannabis have no higher rate of lung cancer than the standard population. So if cannabis smoke was causing cancer or COPD or other issues, you would think there'd be higher rates in cannabis smokers than non-cannabis smokers. And the only time that's true is when that cannabis smoker is also a tobacco smoker. And so we see that cannabis smoke is not nearly as dangerous as smoking other things. Now, is that a good idea still? I'm not going to knock it, but I personally don't smoke very often. Every once in a while I will, because there's some nostalgia there, and it's sort of like this, there's a vibe and a culture around packing the bong and passing it around or sharing a joint. It's sort of the same. It's like breaking bread with family, right? It's a similar concept. But I personally don't smoke that much flower, maybe a couple times a year tops. I do more vaping, and you're right. Vaping has downsides too. Now, you don't get the carcinogens because it's not actually combusting anything. It's not creating that combustion and that burn. It's vaporizing, so it's more or less turning a solid into a vapor that you're inhaled, much like albuterol or some other inhaler you would hit for asthma or something, or COPD. And depending on how clean the oil is, which, as I said, can be a problem on the commercial market and the black market unless you're growing the stuff yourself and know what's in it, or the grower. So is it clean? And then secondarily, what type of carts are they using? Some carts are ceramic and avoid a lot of the problems that you would be inhaling aluminum. Some are absolutely not. It's almost like they're like, hey, the metallic flavor that's how you know it's working. Like they're really bad. So the quality of cartridge, the quality of oil can dictate whether I would say vaping is good or bad. I would say generally it's, in concept, it can be better than smoking. It isn't always necessarily. But those delivery methods are for inhalation, and those are problems, as you stated. I think one of the cleanest methods is probably concentrate smoking through like a dab rig or something like that. Now, for me, now you're ingesting too much THC at one time, and I don't think that's a great thing either. I'm not knocking it again, but it's just not my preference, and I wouldn't generally recommend it for the standard population. But if you take a concentrate, you put it in glass, and you heat up the glass, there's no metal from the cartridge. There's none of that stuff to worry about. And if you have a clean oil, it's a cleaner experience for your body. But to that end, it's why I like edibles for a lot of people, right? Because now you're just eating it. You're skipping the lungs altogether. Your liver's filtering some stuff out. I will say that when you inhale, so the THC compound you get high from is called Delta 9 THC. When you inhale Delta 9 THC, it enters your blood through the same way oxygen does, and it stays Delta 9 THC in your system. When you eat it, your liver processes it, and you have an enzyme that actually does a conversion, and it changes it from Delta 9 THC to 11-hydroxy Delta 9 THC. So edibles are quite literally a different compound by the time it hits your blood than an inhalable. This is why you may have some people that are like, oh yeah, I can smoke a joint, but if you give me an edible, I'll freak out. Like, I will not handle that well. Or vice versa. They can do edibles, they can't smoke. Or they have different tolerances. Like, I could smoke all day, but 10 milligrams is my cap on an edible. I can't go more than that, or vice versa. They can eat 1,000 milligrams in edibles, but they can't take more than 2 hits because your body reacts slightly differently to those things. And a lot of people, there's no difference. It's their tolerances are the same and they process it the same, but it just depends on the person. So all that to say, the delivery method of an inhalation could be a problem, but it's how you get that Delta 9 experience and that Delta 9 into your system, as well as the CBD and everything else that might be in there. When you ingest it, converts some things, and some things get filtered out, so it's less bioavailable. There's a third option, which is something else that we do now at High Spirits Beverage, which is nano-emulsifying the THC oil and putting it in a drink. So essentially, these cannabinoids are an oil. And as you know, oil and water don't mix. So you have to find some way to get that oil to bind to the water. And in doing so, you basically break the crystalline bonds so the molecules fall apart. They're not sticky and stuck together. And then you encapsulate them in some other product that the inside sticks to the oil, the fat part, or lipophilic, and the outside's hydrophilic and sticks to the water part. Then you take all of that material and you dump it into water, it disperses evenly, and it sits perfectly homogenized, just like an alcohol or something else would, that's emulsified properly. And if you're a cook, you know what emulsification is and how it works. So you emulsify it into this product, and now you have a beverage. Well, the cool thing is, because the nano size of those particles are so small, it skips phase 1 metabolization completely, which means you drink it, it kicks in about 10 to 15 minutes on the high side, and it feels like an inhalation experience because it remains Delta 9 instead of doing that conversion. So there's beverages. This is why beverages are taking off in a huge way in the country right now. There's inhalation through smoke, inhalation through vaporization, and then there's general edibles, eating brownies, gummies, that sort of thing.
That's a lot. There's a lot of different ways and I mean, quite honestly, I'll be honest with you. I hate the smell of cigarette smoke, and I hate the smell of pot smoke. Yeah, probably even more. My daughter used to live on Oahu, and I mean, it's just like, it's everywhere, and everybody, and I hate smokers in general because there's so many of them, and my parents were smokers for like 45 years, cigarette smokers. Yeah. And like, they don't seem to realize that not everybody wants to smoke along with them. And I think at least in Honolulu, that's the case with pot smokers as well, because it's like, dude, you think that I really want to walk down this sidewalk and smell your weed and ingest your weed because it stinks. So anyway, so that's more of a cultural thing than anything else. And I think cigarette smokers, whether you're smoking pot or smoking cigarettes, I think it's basically the same kind of thing.
I think it's social responsibility, right? It's that egotistical narcissism that says I'm the most important person, and whatever I want to do is I'm free to do, despite anyone else around me. And I just think that's not cool, no matter what you're doing, right? It doesn't matter if you're playing a trumpet. If you're doing it in a movie theater, people are going to be pissed off. I think you need to be more responsible. I've got to a point where I was a cigarette smoker for about 7 years. And so I get the addiction. I understand it's a problem. But I was always I tried not to smoke where if a kid would start staring at me, I'd put my cigarette behind my back and turn around and walk a different direction. I wouldn't stand next to people. I tried to get away from people to smoke. And not saying that was, I was a great person for doing so. But, it's just that social conscious. And I think people are generally losing that social conscious, and people are more divisive and more willing to say, what can I find about you that I don't like that I could be mad about, instead of what can I find about you that I do like that I could be respectful of, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I posted a meme. I posted a picture of we have wiener dogs, and I posted a picture of a bunch of wiener dogs this morning on my Facebook with the caption, "Everybody in my feed seems to be pissed off about something, so here's something to take your mind about off of whatever you're pissed off about." Because I
love
think
it.
I think we're just it's just crazy. Like what? Like you woke up this morning, you live in one of the richest countries in the world. You're like, what do you have to be pissed off about that is that important? You know, obviously if it's stuff like war and famine but it's not. It's like, you know, the barista at Starbucks got my name mispronounced. That's what I'm pissed off about today. It's
yeah,
like,
I think
people, you know.
I think
Anyway,
people are literally getting addicted to being angry. Like when you feel righteous indignation, there's a certain dopamine release that comes with that because you feel like you're standing up for the right thing. You kind of feel like a little hero. And so, but we're applying this feeling to these little micro things that don't really matter, but we're making it matter as a society. And I think people are literally addicted to the feeling.
Yep. I would recommend everybody does a podcast like this. I mean, I've told my wife, it's like, this podcast, and we're only 50 episodes in. I have another podcast that's on business, but like, you and I would never have this conversation. Like it's, you know, and that's not a bad thing, but it's just like, we would unlikely that the two of our paths would cross in a way that we would be able to have this conversation. And so, and I mean, I've had conversations with my 92-year-old neighbor who was a pastor for 40 years. And then a couple of weeks later, I had a conversation with a sex expert out of Poland, and like and then we're talking, you know, so like that really that it really is fun that's one of the best things about this podcast is just to have that opportunity to engage with people that aren't necessarily like you, and be able to have great conversations and learn from each other and experience this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my recommendation. Go start a podcast and talk to a bunch of different people. That'll make you less angry.
I love it. That's a great idea. Yeah. How do you feel about shifting gears a little bit and talking about, you know, in theme with your podcast here, Maxed Out Man, on how cannabis can be helpful to the adult male in today's world? Great. So,
I love it. I mean, I think you and I, when we talked about this, it's like, hey, I'm not here to educate people on why they want to use cannabis, but I do want to educate men about, you know, this whole thing is about education. So like, if this is something that you're interested in, let's go ahead and educate them for sure.
Great. Well, one, I always recommend, again, high CBD content with your THC. Again, the weed today isn't like the weed of yesterday. And if you're looking to use this as a lifestyle improvement, like a supplement or like a exercise routine or meditation or something like that, you're looking to improve your life through this, it's low and slow, right? You don't need to get blasted. You don't need to be so high that you don't remember where the remote control is and you're too lazy to figure out where you put it. But you can essentially microdose cannabis to just take the edge off. We're talking just a second ago about how people love to get angry. Well, this helps with that a ton. It removes your desire to be angry, and you more desire a dopamine rush off of connecting with other people. So you start looking at people slightly differently, just with a little bit. It doesn't take much. Additionally, there's a lot of benefits. Some of us have, I think legitimately, a lot of humans have a deficient endocannabinoid system. And I think as time progresses, we'll see that there's a certain percentage of diseases that we've attributed to certain things that really stem from the endocannabinoid system not doing its job and getting another system to act accordingly. And so some people need daily consumption of cannabinoids to feel straight, and just that it clears their head a little bit. They function better. Their body feels better. And I think there's a lot of truth to that for a lot of people. So one, it could just be, you could treat it like a supplement and just offset what your body may be missing. And again, start low and slow. If you want to use it recreationally, it's a better option than alcohol. I'm sure a lot of people, even though you generally don't consume, some people in your audience probably do, and they probably do anywhere from sometimes to a lot. Well, it's very toxic, right? Technically, cannabis isn't intoxicating because there's no toxicity levels. Where alcohol is very toxic, and it's basically how you get drunk is you're intoxicated.
It's a poison. I mean, Dr. Andrew Huberman actually did a little post the other day, and he's the neuroscientist. You know who he is, but he's like, people keep asking me how much alcohol is okay, and he's like, none. Like that's the okay amount to put, that's the healthy amount. And granted, then he clarified that and has caveats and all that kind of stuff. But
Sure.
alcohol is a poison. So that's definitely, that should be well known.
Yeah. And in this case, cannabis isn't really, it's more like a supplement for your body. Now, again, it can be abused. We talked about that already, and I'll just caveat that again, that it could be abused for sure and used to an unhealthy level. But if you use it in a responsible manner, in a mature manner, and you're using it to fit your needs, it can be, it's not a poison. It's not toxic. And even recreationally, instead of having a glass of wine after dinner to relax, you can have an edible or a THC beverage or, a lower THC with high CBD product to inhale. And it'll take that edge off for you. It'll help you sleep. I used to have to take Ambien every single night. I could not sleep. I tried every sleep meditation, everything on the planet, and it just didn't work for me. There's something wrong with my brain. It never shuts off. For me, I switched off of Ambien onto edibles. And all of a sudden, I have ADHD. Which I've learned to focus as a superpower generally, where I can hyper intense focus and learn a lot really fast and talk about subjects really fast. And so for the most part, I love having ADHD. It's not a crutch. It's a superpower to some extent. But the downside is my brain never stops. It just keeps going. It's always trying to solve the next problem or think of the next thing. And I'm often thinking of 7 to 10 things at one time. Well, when I consume cannabis, all of that quiets down and I could think about other things like, I wonder if we should repaint the room, just simple thoughts that other people have. And so it really helps with that. And alcohol used to do that for me, but alcohol is toxic and cannabis isn't. Additionally, especially today, we have a hard time being in the here and now. We're always thinking of the next thing. We're pulling out our phone, looking at a feed. We're thinking of the email we need to send tomorrow. We're so in our heads about what's going to happen next that we often miss what's happening right now. You're sitting in the living room with your family and you're playing on your phone instead of talking to your family, right? Things of this nature. Cannabis is great for making you not so much care about what's happening tomorrow and you more care about what's happening right now. And so even from a engaged father sort of point of view, sometimes, you can abuse it and be a checked out father, right? And just be totally worthless to your kids, but used in a reasonable amount, it makes you really present. And all of a sudden you're like, I want to get on the floor and play Legos, right? And I'm going to get together with my kid and we're going to do this thing and it's going to be this great connection. And it's possible through cannabis and not really so much through alcohol. You get kind of sassy with your kids after a couple drinks, it's a very different experience, but so there's those sorts of benefits. And then in the massive, like the powerlifting community, and Olympic lifting community to some extent, a lot of those folks use cannabis to improve their gains and improve their performance. And it's not quite the performance enhancing drug that, when we talk about PEDs, there's a bunch of things probably come to mind when you say PED, right? Cannabis usually isn't one of them. And it doesn't really function like those other things do. But what it does is, again, it gets your endocannabinoid system functioning properly, which I believe probably aids in muscle development and fine tuning your systems. But I mean, there's a reason that Arnold Schwarzenegger used to consume cannabis before he lifted. There's a reason a lot of lifters do it. And the thought is, and the general anecdotal evidence, well, we don't have any scientific trials to prove this, is that you recover significantly faster from pushing your body to its limits. You have a higher limit that you can push through and still be, reasonably comfortable in performing while consuming cannabis. And so it helps you in training, maybe not so much on game day for some people, maybe, but maybe not others. But during training, it helps your body perform and recover better, which, as somebody who's very fitness minded yourself, I'm sure you understand recovery is 9 out of 10 parts of the battle. You just got to recover well and recover in a way that aids in muscle development and cardiovascular fine tuning instead of recovering in a way that's, the antithesis of that. So It helps with recovery. I suspect it helps with muscle growth. I don't really have anything to prove that. That's just my gut feeling on it, but I don't really know. But used properly, it could be an aid in a lot of things that the modern man is dealing with. But again, you want to do it in moderation. You don't want to overdo it, and you want to have the right size for the right problem.
Yeah. And is there a resource that someone could go to learn more about, just like, hey, I want to try edibles. And again, I'm not advocating you're giving the benefits and all that kind of stuff. I'm not advocating through this podcast that everybody starts using cannabis. Like, that's obviously from an industry standpoint, that's a good thing for you. But but if someone wants to go learn more about, like, how do they, like, where do they even go to learn about this stuff?
This is a good question, and it's a hard thing to answer as well. And the reason is because it's been Schedule 1 for so long, you weren't allowed to research it. Right. So if you want empirical data that's been tested and proven, it was kind of hard to find for a while because of the Schedule 1 nature. Now, thankfully, other countries have picked up the ball and ran with it. Israel has a ton of great medical studies that you could look at, and they've been a kind of a pioneer in cannabis. There's a particular doctor over there that it just recently passed that was he's the one that discovered the cannabinoid system and discovered cannabinoids and how they bind and et cetera. Discovered THC, CBD, and all those things. So there's unless you're like really good at going on to PubMed and looking at research and reading that and comprehending it, it's kind of hard to find resources that you trust. Part of the other problem is because of Schedule 1 nature, the only people that knew anything about it were black market folks. Black market folks, some of them are crazy smart, some of them not so much. And some of that bro science that we call it in the industry now has proliferated amongst as gospel truth, as scientific fact, and it's not. So sometimes you'll be reading something that just is not true. For example, most cannabis consumers still think that indica and sativa is a thing and that it dictates your experience. Well, both those things are false to an extent. And science has proven this, but the bro science says otherwise. And so you may get a book that's loaded with bro science and you don't even know it. So there's a couple books that I generally recommend. Excuse me. One of them is called CBD Healing Without the High or something to that effect. You can get on Amazon. Really solid view of positives and dangers and what scientific data do we know for fact about this right now, as well as the history of how we got to where we're at. Other than that, it's listening to podcasts. It's finding cannabis scientists that are in the space doing education, follow the content they put on LinkedIn, Facebook, etc., Twitter, perhaps. But it's still kind of, the information is desperate from each other and it's not always true. So I don't really have a perfect answer for you because there's an answer yet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I've taken up a ton of your time. This has been super interesting. Anything else that you think we ought to know that can kind of, obviously I want to, and also how do we find you? But if there's any kind of last thoughts you want to give us, I'd love to hear them too.
Certainly. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn if you're the businessy type. Chris Font's on there with High Spirits Beverages, Trojan Horse Cannabis. If you're interested in our products, trojanhorsecannabis.com, highspiritsbeverages.com. You might see me at symposiums or on the Hill at some point. If you run into me there, great. And then any parting knowledge, I would say just cannabis isn't the devil we've been told it is. It's also not the silver bullet that the industry thinks it is. So if it's right for you, which you can determine that on your own, enter it low and slow. There's no race here. You don't have to start with 10 megs and hope that you don't die from that. Start with 1 and see how it goes. Play with different CBD ratios. The biggest secret to cannabis that is still not known by most of the industry is CBD and THC work better together. Don't separate them. There's no reason to go with a CBD isolate product or a THC isolate product unless you're drug tested for your job and you're like licensed in a way that you can't pop a dirty with THC. THC and CBD always work better together. Keep them together, start low, titrate up until you find whatever relief it is you're looking for, whether it's sleeping better, exercising better, being a more present parent, whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Start low, increment up over days. It doesn't need to be the same day because you have that oops edible experience we talked about earlier. Titrate up until your symptoms are where you want them to be, and then stop there. There's no reason to get blasted every day and get your tolerance through the roof. It's just going to lead to problems and it gets expensive and there's no real reason for it. So start low and slow. Don't be afraid of it. But if you don't need it, you don't need it as well. So there's no pressure to jump into that.
Nice. All right, Chris, I appreciate your time, man. Thanks so much for educating us today.
Yeah, of course. Kevin, thanks for having me on.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.